Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today I am so excited because we're going to be talking about the civil liberties legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic and how government responses to that virus in Canada changed our legal and cultural landscape in many ways and may have changed civil liberties in Canada forever. I have a new book that has just been released on the topic called Pandemic Panic, which I co-authored with my colleague, executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Joanna Baron. We spent 2 years documenting government responses to the pandemic, noting where the government got things right and where they went too far, and what lessons we need to learn from that crisis. If we don't remember the history of the pandemic, including the negative history, we are bound to repeat it when the next crisis comes along. The book has already sold hundreds of copies on Amazon, which is where you can order it today. Now, here today to talk about the legacy of the pandemic on our civil rights is my colleague, Joanna. Joanna, thank you so much for coming today. I'm just always thrilled to have you in the studio. Let's talk pandemic legacy. Now, one of the things that we realized writing this book, we had this experience where we had both actually forgotten so many of the sort of strange and bizarre things that happened during the pandemic. And, not all of these things engaged our civil liberties or our constitutional rights, but they certainly provoked some thinking about the logic of the government. Now, one of my favorite examples, or maybe his least favorite examples, is when the City of Toronto government roped off the cherry blossoms in the spring because I guess you were maybe going to catch COVID from looking at some flowers. But what is your favorite example of this kind of bizarre logic or lack of logic from the pandemic?
Well, so two examples came to mind, and I wanted to bring up two examples that, when these things were happening, more often than not, you were the person that I first had to process with. And there were two examples when you and I were both just utterly agog. The first was in April 2021 when Doug Ford announced, I believe it was the third lockdown, where it was going to be a stay-at-home order, where specifically, and this was specifically enumerated, the police had the authority to question you anytime you were outside of your home. And of course, they were also roping off playgrounds, even at a point where school closures had been extensive and we knew outdoor transmission was very rare. So we were texting and so depressed. And the second was, of course, and I know we're going to talk about this, but was when Chrystia Freeland spoke at the press conference on February 14th, 2022, and said, we are going to be freezing bank accounts and giving the banks the authority to do this without a warrant and with full indemnification. So those two, I don't think I'll ever forget that for the rest of my life. How about you?
Yeah, I think that those are some of the high watermarks in terms of real overreach of the pandemic. I think that when we look back at this time, the problem of government overreach, I think the most serious example is probably the federal government, the Justin Trudeau government's use of the Emergencies Act in response to the 2022 Freedom Convoy, that protest that was entrenched in Ottawa for all those weeks. But I think for me, kind of these strange examples, and when we were writing this book, we would go back through old video footage. And I remember this footage of a man at Blue Mountain ski resort who was not wearing a mask to get onto the ski lift. He was wearing, I guess, a balaclava, which serves the same purpose as a cloth mask, but it was not a cloth mask. And he was forcibly pulled off the chairlift as he was loading by some employees and dragged away. And similarly, I remember an incident in Quebec, which we talk about at length in our chapter about privacy rights, was this horrendous scene at Christmas where the Quebec government had put restrictions on how many people could attend a New Year's or a Christmas party. And I think that this was a New Year's party, actually, not a Christmas party. And some member of the neighborhood had called the police to report on their neighbors having few too many people at New Year's. And I watched this video of police stepping over the threshold of a home, pulling on elderly people, pulling them out into the snow and ice outside, trampling a Christmas wreath underneath their feet. I mean, that to me is an image I don't think I'm ever going to forget of the government empowering police to act this way and then them exercising their discretion in such an egregiously awful manner. Now, when we come back from the break, I want to talk about how we broke this book out into different chapters dealing with all the different fundamental freedoms we have. We'll be right back.